The fighting in Gaza should stop very soon, within days, if all goes according to plan. The Qatari government, which has been mediating talks between Israel and Hamas, says the two sides have agreed to a ceasefire.
Everyone has been celebrating since the news of the ceasefire.
The key here is whether or not the ceasefire is going to hold.
There are a lot of obstacles still in the road.
So let me just be straight with you. There are very few concrete details about the deal itself, besides the fact that both the Qatari and American governments have confirmed there is a deal. But even then, it still has to be approved by Israel's parliament in a vote. And even if everything's in writing, signed and stamped, ceasefires are delicate, and this is still an incredibly fragile process. So let's go through the broad strokes, the surest details that we can give, and then we'll get into the murkier territory of what's believed to be in the deal, based on what officials have said publicly and on what we know about previous attempts at a ceasefire.
This is the exact framework of the deal I proposed back in May. Exact.
According to a draft of the deal seen by Reuters, there are three big phases to the ceasefire. The first focused on exchanging people, pulling out troops, and letting in aid. The second phase is likely to be a continuation of that, working towards a full release of hostages, a full Israeli withdrawal, and a more permanent ceasefire. Then the third phase, looking much further forward, to the reconstruction of Gaza itself. The broad idea that there are three phases, this is confirmed by both the Qataris and the Americans. Most of what we know today is about the first phase.
Some 33 hostages are to be released in this first phase of the ceasefire.
So let's talk about hostages. When Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, 2023, they took just over 250 people captive. Today, in 2025, by most accounts, somewhere around 94 Israeli hostages remain in captivity. According to our reporters, what we may see first is the release of 3 of those hostages, potentially as soon as this Sunday.
We have heard that on Sunday, they have already chosen 3 women to be released.
According to Qatar's prime minister, early priority is being given to women, children, the elderly, and the wounded. 33 in all, over the course of phase 1, which would last 6 weeks. In exchange, some number of Palestinian prisoners currently being held in Israeli jails would also be released. The US president says this number is in the hundreds. But let's talk about soldiers. A very contentious part of the ceasefire deal has been how fast and how far must Israel withdraw from Gaza. Gaza right now is cut in half by what's called the Netzarim corridor. And this isn't just some imaginary line, it's a literal pathway that has been cut into the land, built by the Israeli army, paved and fortified, in which it began showing to Israeli media outlets about a year ago. Israel considers this corridor critical to controlling the northern half of Gaza, to effectively keep people out and to wage its war against Hamas. Now let me show you what's called the Philadelphia corridor, which is the strip of land where Gaza borders Egypt. Palestinians say this is a vital link to the outside world, where fuel, food, and medical aid come in. Israel says this is a conduit for smuggled weapons and rockets, the fuel that allows Hamas to keep fighting. I raise these because an important aspect of the ceasefire will have to do with whether Israeli troops must withdraw from these areas. A proposed ceasefire back in May, the one on which Biden says today's ceasefire is modeled, called for Israeli troops to withdraw from those 2 corridors. But at least in the case of the Philadelphia corridor, the office of the Israeli prime minister issued a statement suggesting Israeli forces will maintain their presence there. Due to the strong insistence of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Hamas folded on its last-minute demand to change the deployment of IDF forces in the Philadelphia corridor. But various reports of the details of this ceasefire agreement suggest Palestinians who lived in northern Gaza are meant to be able to return home in this opening phase of the deal, which raises a question to which we have no clear answer. will Israel withdraw from its position, which cleaves Gaza in two? Or will it act instead as a kind of checkpoint, a gateway under Israeli control to allow people to cross that line? We don't know. A critical part of this ceasefire is that it allows humanitarian aid to begin flowing more freely once again.
Phase 1 also includes an increased flow of relief and humanitarian aid to all parts of the Gaza Strip.
Before the war, Gaza had something like 500, 600 trucks coming into the territory per day, delivering food, fuel, medicine, supplies, commercial goods too, whatever was needed to sustain its population of more than 2 million. But now, after 15 months of devastating, destructive fighting, where aid has become more critical than ever, aid groups say that inflow of goods is maybe a tenth of what it was, at times less than that. The terms of this ceasefire are expected to go some distance in restoring the previous levels of aid.
What do we prioritize? For UNICEF, it's medicines, it's food, it's fuel for those hospitals. You've got families who have been pushed, to the very, very brink, who've lost homes, who've seen their homes just turned into rubble, who are in tents.
Tents because it's winter. And according to the UN, nearly all Gazans have been displaced. They can't go home, either because they've been forced out or there's no home left. According to Gaza's health ministry, more than 46,000 others are dead, killed in the war since it began just over a year ago.
Of course, we've just heard the news that the ceasefire has been agreed upon. You can see the jubilation in the faces of the people here. We are really overwhelmed with happiness because the bloodshed has ended. This does not mean that the suffering has ended, however.
I'll say again, ceasefires are brittle things. Any or all of the way things are expected to unfold may fall apart. But the overarching goal of phase 1 of this ceasefire is to make it to phase 2.
The permanent end of the war. Let me say it again, a permanent end of the war.
According to President Biden, it's during phase 1, so over the course of the next 6 weeks, fighting will pause and negotiators from both sides will return to the table to figure out the parameters of a permanent ceasefire. Something that would, according to earlier drafts of the ceasefire, work towards the complete withdrawal of all Israeli troops from Gaza, and that would see the full return of war dead on both sides, their bodies, their remains, going back to their families.
We will continue to do everything we can, everything possible, together with our partners to ensure that this deal is implemented as it's agreed, and this deal will bring us peace, hopefully, at the end of it.
But first things first, the hostages, the aid, guns down. These are the priorities. And this Sunday, January 19th, is when it is all expected to begin.